And I'd like to call your attention to Scripture in the Gospel recorded by Luke, the 18th, or the 4th chapter and 18th verse. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And I'd like for you to recall a phrase from one of Martin Luther King's speeches, his now famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which says, "I have a dream that is deeply rooted in the American dream." And some lines from the preamble to the Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. But among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I'd like to talk to you just briefly on the subject, Jesus, Martin, and the American dream. Jesus, Martin, and the American dream. Now, this anniversary or this holiday, this year, marks actually the 40th anniversary or the 40th year since the murder or assassination, as some would prefer to call it, of Martin Luther King Jr. And since that time, I have probably done more lectures or speeches or sermons on that occasion or on the life of Martin Luther King than most public speakers. I have lectured at colleges and universities. I have lectured on television. I've lectured for the government. I've lectured for high schools and civic groups and community groups on Martin Luther King. And you would think that since I've done so many lectures, I would just go back into my notes and say the things that I said in those lectures. But actually, this presentation is different. It is actually a new presentation. Now, why I go through the trouble of doing that is beyond me, since you heard none of the others, and probably would have been just as happy to hear one of my sermons that was done years ago on Martin Luther King. But I thought that just for a few minutes today, I would just talk about this, maybe because it's challenging to me to say something new and different and more refreshing, even though the material in all those other presentations was good, I suppose. But I think that to talk a little bit about Jesus, Martin, and the American dream puts this in a religious context, in which I would insist that it be in a religious context if I were to do it from the pulpit. Because I don't really talk about much from the pulpit that is not pulpit material. I lecture at colleges and universities, and when I'm at a university, I talk about university stuff, or I talk about the stuff that I talk about in a university way. When I'm talking to civic groups, I talk about the stuff that I talk about in a civic way. And when I'm in the pulpit, I talk about the stuff that I talk about in a pulpit way. And that is to say that everything that I talk about in the pulpit must ultimately be connected to Jesus. Because the church was built as a preaching place for people who wanted to talk about Jesus. So I want to talk about Jesus, Martin, and the American dream. And notice how they are ordered: Jesus, Martin, and the American dream. Now, in order to understand, and let me make it clear that this holiday that people celebrate, it's really not so much about Martin Luther King, the individual. And a lot of people are opposed to the holiday, and I understand why people were opposed to the Martin Luther King holiday, because we have a lot of holidays already. And to give people a day off cost a lot of money. So people don't have to be racist just because they didn't want this to be a holiday. So it's understandable why folk would not necessarily want it to be a holiday. But you know, the fact of the matter is, you don't have to have a holiday to honor a person and an idea. So maybe the rush to make it a holiday might have been the wrong emphasis. But it's really not a holiday about Martin Luther King in the first place. What the holiday, if it is to be one and to be most effective, would be about is the idea and the ideals that Martin Luther King lived his life to promote. And those ideas and ideals were rooted in the teachings of Jesus Christ. So that is why the sermon is called Jesus, Martin, and the American Dream. Now, in order to understand a person, it is, and the importance of a person and a person's contributions, it is sometimes necessary to understand the times that the person lived in. Sometimes it becomes popular for folks now to hear somebody do a pretty good speech or someone to say something and they say, oh, that's another Martin Luther King. Well, be very careful in making people another Martin Luther King. You just can't take anybody graduated from a fancy university with a few degrees behind his name and make him a Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King did not become Martin Luther King because he had a degree from Morehouse and Boston University. There's more to Martin Luther King and the people of that time than their degrees. It was a condition that they faced and embraced, a condition that they fought against, and a condition that they changed that made them what they were. And if you haven't experienced and been exposed to that condition, it would be very difficult for you to be a Martin Luther King. So we have to understand the condition. And we have to understand the condition that Jesus came into. So when Jesus comes upon the scene and says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. We have to understand what the condition was. The condition was very different one from that which it is today. Those people lived poor, struggling lives. Those people lived lives where human life was not important, and the human life expectancy was around 40 years old, and people lived in sickness and suffering and in servitude most of their lives. And Jesus comes on the scene and said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and I've come to change some of that.
Jesus came into a condition that was very degrading and dehumanizing, very sad and depressing. People didn't have much to look to and to look forward to. Oh, we don't know how blessed we are sometimes when we experience all the niceties that we have. We don't know how blessed we are. We talk about the difficulties. Some people probably didn't come to church today because it was cold. Well, it is cold, but it's a different thing when you have to get up in the morning and just push the thermostat upward. Or when you have to get up in the morning to make a fire. We sometimes don't know how good we have it. That you can go out and turn the car on and let it warm, and go back in the house and let it warm up. And then go get in the car. As opposed to walking to church in the cold. You have to understand a condition to understand the people who are produced or developed by that condition. And the condition that Jesus met and found people in, human beings in, was very different from the condition that we are in today. And for him to come and to that condition and say to the people, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and I'm among you. And he was saying to those folks that the presence of God is among you. Jesus brought to the world a sense of the presence of God. I remember I told you how sad that world was, how depressing the condition of the people was. They worked day in and day out. Everything was geared toward providing them simply their daily bread. And they might have thought that they were alone in this giant universe. And Jesus comes to them and says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has sent me. In other words, God is present among you. God is with you. What a wonderful, exciting message that must have been for those people. All of these years, it had been 476 years since Malachi the prophet had walked and preached among men. And so Jesus comes on the scene and said, you are not forgotten. God is with you. And when someone comes from God, whether it's a Jesus or a Martin, it is good to feel when you're in the presence of those people that God is among you. I remember when I preached at Dexter Avenue King Memorial, the church in Montgomery, Alabama, that Martin Luther King pastored. And I was there to preach, and one of the persons, or several of the persons actually, was still there who were there when Martin Luther King preached. And of course, to go where he preached, it was quite a challenge to me. And one of the women told me that there was something about him, something special. And she said, and they were almost glowing her eyes when she said to me, when he talked, you felt like God was talking to you. He made them feel the presence of God. Jesus came upon the scene and told these people, God is upon me. God has sent me to do this. God has told me to tell you certain things, that we are going to release the captives. I'm preaching deliverance to you. I'm preaching the gospel to the poor. God is among you now. Oh, it's a challenging thing to assure people, to challenge people,
to inform people that God is with them, that God is watching out for them, and God is watching over them, and God is watching them. You know, it's nice for us to think that God is watching out for us, and God is watching over us. But the God who watches out for us and watches over us also watches us. So you better be careful. Because God, a lot of us want God to watch out for us and want God to watch over us, but we want him to shut his eyes when we are doing mean things. See, God also watches you. You know, it would be nice to have God just watch over me. And then when I get ready to do some things I don't want him to see, now you go on now and let me do this, and then you come back and watch. But that's not the way God is. God watches over you, and also God watches you. So Jesus comes to let us know that there is a God in our midst that's watching us. Martin Luther King said to America, there's a God in our midst watching over you. Now, the second thing I think that we ought to understand about this on this Martin Luther King holiday weekend and Jesus, that Jesus challenged us to have a sense of social responsibility one to the other. Before Jesus, there wasn't really a lot of talk about man's social responsibility to man. Jesus tells us that there is this social responsibility, this social connectedness that we have one to the other, and it is to extend beyond our racial or ethnic groups. You see, the Jews were good people to each other. You see, the Ten Commandments, I don't want to get into the controversy, but it's the truth. The Ten Commandments were actually seen by the Jews as the way the Jews ought to treat Jews. That's what the Ten Commandments were about. It was about the way Jews were to treat Jews as they understood it. Jesus challenged the Jews to go outside of their ethnicity, to go outside of their racial identity, to go outside of their little corridors and see mankind as the children of God. That's what the parable of the Good Samaritan is partly about. That's what the story about the woman at the well is about. That Jesus said, I'm reaching out beyond one little group, that all men are children of God. All men are brothers, and God is the Father of all humanity. So, Jesus challenged a sense of brotherhood and a sense of social responsibility. Martin King comes along and challenges a sense of brotherhood and a sense of social responsibility. You see, a lot of times people get confused about what black folk needed in America. They say, oh, what we need in America from white folks is we need justice and equality. Well, in America, people need more than justice and equality. When you have been slaves for hundreds of years and are set free, you need more than justice and equality. When you have been discriminated against for hundreds of years, you need more than justice and equality. When you have when you've been uprooted from all the things that you knew about and supported your survival, you need more than justice and equality. Poor people in a society such as ours need the compassion of the folks who have more than they need justice and equality. You see, justice and equality will not help you if you start off at the bottom. You see,
When they say, well, in our society, the rich gets richer. There's something wrong with it. No, it's not. That's the way it is supposed to be. The folks who have will always have more when the system works the way the system is set up. There's nothing wrong with the rich getting richer in a system. If I have $1 million and you have 1,000 in the stock market, I'm going to make way more money than you make. And for you to say the system is broken, you're saying that I'm something wrong without making this money. There's nothing wrong with the rich getting richer in a system that's set up mathematically accurate. That's what happens. What is wrong in a society is when the rich don't care anything about the poor. That's what's wrong. There's nothing wrong with Bill Gates being a multimillionaire, a billionaire. There's nothing wrong with that. And our society allowed Bill Gates to have that kind of money and got it pretty fair, I suppose, within the law. There's nothing wrong with people being multimillionaire and even billionaire in America. That's part of what the American dream and the American opportunity allow. But it is something disgusting when people have that much of the resources of the world and don't care about the people who have little or nothing. That's what's wrong. And that's the challenge of the preachers. Not so much to preach equality for the poor, but to have these other folk to have compassion, to know that God is watching. That's why Jesus tells the parable about Lazarus and the rich man. I heard Martin Luther King say one day in talking about that parable, he said that Diogenes did not go to hell because he was rich. The Diogenes went to hell because he maximized the minimum and minimized the maximum. Diogenes went to hell because he allowed Lazarus to walk by him every day and never saw him. So Jesus challenged people to have a sense of social responsibility for each other. And if people have a sense of social responsibility for each other, they will not be comfortable having everything living behind gated walls or living in mansions that are walled off from the public, while poor people don't have the needs, the things they need to have dignified lives. They wouldn't be comfortable. That's part of the challenge of Jesus. And that's the challenge of Martin Luther King. That we are too rich of a nation to have things going on that are undignified. We are too blessed as a people to not be concerned about the poor. And finally, Jesus introduces us to the idea of a community based upon human worth and dignity. You see, I told you that these people at the time that Jesus was born, there was not much sense of love for life. There was not much sense of the value of human beings. There was not much sense of human dignity. And in America, our Constitution, our preamble make this bold statement that we have this belief that man was born with certain inalienable rights, that these inalienable rights were given to him by God. And that makes him a dignified human being. That makes him a human being that is worth something. That makes him a human being that is tied to all other human beings. And every other human being should care about what happens to human beings. And that's what this holiday is about. Now let me point out clear up one thing to you.
We refer to this as a Christian nation. This is not a Christian nation. America is not a Christian nation. Now, this is not some preacher getting ready to condemn folks in America because they're not doing certain things. This is not a Christian nation, and Christians need to get that clear. This is a nation where our Constitution runs things. This is not a nation where the Bible or the Ten Commandments are our Constitution. Our Constitution is written by carnal men. And we are not a Christian nation, and were never intended to be a Christian nation, and no Christian should be running around saying that we are a Christian nation. In order to be a citizen of the United States, one of the things you have to do is to be born here. And anybody who's born here is a citizen and is protected by the Constitution. In order to be a Christian, you have to be born again. So you see, this is not a Christian nation. But this is a nation where the majority of us claim to be Christians. And at some point, that which we claim to be in our hearts ought to be reflected in the way we live our lives. So even though we can't make the government act like Christians, all of those who say that we know Christ ought to be doing everything that we can to make sure that our communities look like communities where people are following Christ as they obey the Constitution. That's the challenge. You see, you have to preach Jesus, not legislate him. So Martin Luther King, Jesus Christ, and all of the preachers ought to be telling people that if we want folk to have the American dream, we need to become the kind of persons in our own lives that we believe in the worth of every individual. And we're going to do everything that we can to make sure that every child of God has the best life that any child of God could have. And that's kind of the promise of America and the American dream. That's why people come here from all over the world, because we promote that every child of God has a right to try to be everything that God has prepared him and blessed him and gifted him or her to be. And this is a place where they can be that. So that's why Martin Luther King, this holiday can be celebrated, not because of King, but because of Jesus, and because we are a country where those of us who are Christians say that we are working to make the dream of Jesus become a reality in our lives and in our community. So that all of these people, as Jesus says to here, that I'm going to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And that might be the time that Martin was talking about when he said, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.